The sound of horse hooves echoed across the silent desert, breaking the stillness of dawn. A crimson sun began to rise over Cairo, painting the sky with hues of blood and gold. The city below, the heart of the Mamluk Empire, was awakening. But behind the walls of its grand palaces and bustling markets lay a world few ever spoke of. A world ruled not just by power and steel, but by fear and silence. The year was 1260. The Mamluks, once enslaved warriors from the steppes of Central Asia, now ruled one of the greatest empires of the Islamic world. They had overthrown their masters, defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut, and stood as the proud protectors of Islam. But their empire was not built only on honor and faith. It was built on the backs of those who could not fight back, and among their silent victims were the Christian women of the lands they conquered. The chroniclers of that age, Muslim and Christian alike, wrote with trembling hands about the days when Mamluk soldiers swept through villages of the Levant and Anatolia. Their banners fluttered like shadows across ruined churches. The call to prayer echoed over towns where church bells had once rung. And among the spoils of war, women, wives, daughters, and mothers were taken, their fates bound to the whims of men who knew neither mercy nor restraint. In the beginning, many thought captivity meant only servitude, but the truth was far darker. The Mamluks saw themselves not merely as rulers, but as masters of destiny, conquerors who believed that every soul captured by their sword was a symbol of divine favor. To them, a Christian captive was not a person, but a prize, proof of victory and faith. In Cairo, Damascus, and Alexandria, slave markets thrived under the shadows of grand minarets. Traders called out prices as if selling silk or spices, but behind those shouts were women trembling in silence. Some came from faraway lands, Armenia, Georgia, Greece, even from the edges of the Crusader states. Torn from their families, they were brought before the Mamluk elite, who examined them not for their worth as human beings, but for their youth, beauty, and obedience. Yet amidst the cruelty, a strange paradox existed. Some of these women were elevated into royal courts, dressed in fine silks and given new names. They became concubines, servants, or even mothers to princes. But that luxury came at a cost, the price of identity, of faith, of freedom. Once they entered the Mamluk palaces, their old lives vanished like sand in the desert wind. The story of one such woman, though her real name has been lost to time, is preserved in the whispers of Cairo's old chronicles. She was said to be a young Greek woman from the Aegean coast, captured during a raid on a Crusader-held island. Her beauty was said to rival the moonlight itself. She was brought to the court of Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, the most powerful ruler of his time. There, she was given the name Layla. But Layla's beauty, though it earned her a place among the Sultan's attendants, also became her curse. Layla's story mirrors the countless unnamed women whose lives were rewritten by conquest. Within the palace, she was surrounded by jewels, perfumes, and music, but the walls were her prison. Guards watched every move. Her Christian faith, once her guiding light, became a dangerous secret. To be caught praying or wearing a cross was an act of rebellion, and yet, in the quiet of night, she whispered her prayers beneath her breath, clinging to the hope that one day she might see her homeland again. Outside the palace walls, the common Christian captives suffered a fate far more brutal. In the bustling quarters of Cairo, Christian women were sold to wealthy merchants, military officers, and even clerics. Some were forced to convert to Islam, others served their masters for life. But the Mamluk code, though strict for men of power, had no mercy for the conquered. Any sign of defiance could mean punishment, exile, or worse. Historians describe the Mamluk world as one of contrasts, grandeur and decay, devotion and cruelty. The same men who commissioned mosques and schools also commanded armies that burned villages and enslaved thousands. Their loyalty to their sultan was absolute, but their cruelty to the powerless knew no limits. For Christian women caught in their grasp, hope was a fragile thing, often extinguished before it could take root. Yet not all Mamluks were monsters. Some chroniclers tell of rulers who, moved by compassion or conscience, freed captives or granted them dignity. Sultan Qalawun, for instance, was known to release Christian prisoners after victories, demanding only ransom or conversion. But for every merciful act, there were 10 others marked by greed and violence. For every Layla who lived in the palace, Hundreds languished in forgotten corners, their stories lost in the dust of history. The church, though far away, heard whispers of their suffering. In Europe, priests and merchants spoke of the women of the East, pleading with kings and popes to intervene. But politics and distance silenced their cries. The Crusades had failed, and Christendom was too divided to save its own. So the fate of those women remained sealed, hidden behind the golden gates of Cairo. Inside the Mamluk palaces, power was a game of survival. Even the mighty were not safe. Sultans were often assassinated by their own guards, and loyalty could turn to treachery overnight. For the women, this instability meant living in constant fear, for each new ruler could change their lives forever. A woman favored by one sultan might be discarded or enslaved again by his successor. Their identities were fluid, rewritten with every shift of power. Layla's tale, as told in later writings, ends in mystery. Some say she escaped with the help of a sympathetic guard, vanishing into the chaos of Cairo's streets. Others claim she was executed after being accused of treason, perhaps for attempting to flee or for secretly clinging to her Christian faith. Whatever her fate, her story symbolizes the silent resistance of thousands like her, women who refused to forget who they were, even when the world tried to erase them. As the 14th century dawned, the Mamluk Empire reached the height of its power. Its cities glittered with wealth. Scholars, architects, and poets praised the glory of the sultans. Yet beneath that splendor, the empire carried a dark secret: the suffering of those who had built it. Christian, Jewish, and even Muslim slaves formed the invisible foundation of Mamluk society, and among them the voices of the women were the most silenced of all. Some of these women bore children who would rise to power. Ironically, their blood would mix with that of the very men who had enslaved them. The sons of Christian concubines became emirs, generals, even sultans. History, in its cruel way, ensured that the oppressed became part of the oppressor's legacy. By the time the Ottoman Turks conquered Egypt in 1517, the Mamluk age was fading. Their once mighty legions were broken, their palaces crumbling. But the memories of their reign, of conquest, power, and cruelty, lived on in the stories passed down through generations. The chronicles of travelers, monks, and merchants continued to echo the same truth, that beneath the glory of the Mamluk banner lay a history written in tears. And though centuries have passed, the ruins of old Cairo still whisper their names. The stones of ancient palaces, the dim corridors of the citadel, and the silent mosques hold secrets that no historian can ever fully uncover. For the greatest tragedies of history are not the battles lost or the kingdoms fallen, but the forgotten lives buried beneath them. This was only the beginning of their story, because the true horror of what awaited those women, the endless cycles of fear, faith, and forbidden hope, would only unfold in the years that followed. Night had fallen over Cairo, the kind of night where the wind carried both prayers and secrets. The city that glittered by day in gold and marble now shimmered in torchlight and silence. Somewhere beyond the walls of the Sultan's citadel, the cries of captives still echoed, though few dared to listen. For in the age of the Mamluks, silence was survival, and memory was a dangerous thing. Years had passed since the early conquests that filled the slave markets of Egypt. The Mamluk Empire had grown more powerful, its reach extending from the shores of the Mediterranean to the deserts of Arabia. But power, as always, came at a price, and it was the powerless who paid it. The Christian women taken from the lands of Syria, Armenia, and Greece had now become an invisible class within the empire. Some lived within noble households, others labored in the service of soldiers and merchants. Many were forced to accept Islam, their baptisms forgotten, their names replaced, and yet deep within their hearts, they clung to fragments of who they once were, fragments that no sword could erase. It is said that in those years, hidden brotherhoods of Christian captives began to emerge in the narrow alleys of Cairo and Damascus. Women and men who, under the cover of darkness, whispered old hymns, passed bread as communion, and drew crosses into the sand, symbols that would vanish with a single breath of wind. These were not rebels with weapons, but rebels of faith. Their defiance was silence, their victory, remembrance. Among the few stories that survived from that time is one told by a Syrian monk who claimed to have escaped Mamluk captivity. He wrote of a woman known only as Maryam of Tyre, She had been captured as a child, raised in servitude, and sold from master to master until she entered the palace of a powerful emir in Cairo. Though she lived surrounded by gold and perfumes, she remained a stranger in her own body, her soul belonging to a god she could never openly name. Mariam was known among the servants for her calm, her quiet strength. When others wept, she comforted them. When the palace was struck by plague, she nursed the sick at the risk of her own life. Her devotion caught the attention of the emir's wife, who began to question her own beliefs. The chronicles say that Mariam's faith shone brighter than fear, and that even those who served the Sultan could not help but respect her courage. But courage in the Mamluk world came with a price. When Mariam was accused of teaching other servants Christian prayers, she was brought before the emir's court. Her choice was simple: renounce her faith or face punishment. The chronicles never say what she chose, but they note that soon after, the emir's palace was struck by fire, and Mariam's name was never mentioned again. Some say she perished in the flames. Others believe she escaped into the desert, joining a hidden band of freed captives. Whatever her fate, her story lived on as a whisper, the whisper of a woman who refused to bow to fear. While stories like Mariam's faded into legend, the world beyond Egypt was changing. Europe had lost its crusader states, but the memory of the Holy Land burned in its heart. Merchants, travelers, and priests who visited Mamluk lands carried tales of what they had seen, of Christian captives, of silent suffering, of forgotten faith. The Mamluk rulers dismissed these as lies spread by enemies, yet in truth, beneath the empire's grandeur, unrest was growing. Even within Mamluk ranks, there were those who questioned their own cruelty. Some of the younger soldiers, born in Egypt, never having known the life of a slave, looked at the suffering around them and saw the reflection of their own ancestors. For every Mamluk who wielded a sword, there had once been another enslaved boy who had stood trembling before a master. The empire had turned its own pain into power, and that cycle of domination had consumed everyone in its path. By the early 15th century, the once mighty Mamluk system had begun to crack. Corruption spread through the ranks, and greed devoured the ideals of loyalty and faith. In the slave markets, fewer captives arrived from the north, not because compassion had grown, but because the roots themselves had changed. The Christian kingdoms had strengthened their borders, and the Black Death had decimated populations across continents. But for those already enslaved, life remained unchanged. In the old quarters of Cairo, Christian women who had been taken decades earlier were now aging, their faces lined with stories untold. Some had raised children who never knew their mother's true name or faith. Others had faded into anonymity, buried in unmarked graves far from their homelands. History did not write their names, but their absence became its silent wound. And yet, even in the empire's final days, there were glimmers of redemption. Records from late Mamluk rule describe rulers granting freedom to entire groups of Christian captives. Some were allowed to return to their churches, others permitted to travel back to their lands if they could pay ransom. It was as if, at the twilight of their reign, the Mamluks sought to cleanse their conscience of centuries of cruelty. When the Ottomans marched into Cairo in 1517, the age of the Mamluks came to an end. The once feared warrior class was defeated, their sultans executed, their palaces seized. But as history often does, it left behind more than ruins. It left behind memories, scars, and lessons written not in ink but in blood and silence. Travelers who visited the fallen capital spoke of old women seen in the city's alleys, their accents foreign, their eyes carrying the weight of distant lands. They were said to be the last of the Christian captives, survivors of an empire that had forgotten them. Some were cared for by the Christian communities that still lived quietly in Egypt, their faith preserved in secret for centuries. And so, the story of the Christian women under the Mamluks does not end with their suffering, but with their endurance. They became symbols of resilience, living proof that faith can outlast empires. Their voices, though lost to history, still echo in the stones of old churches and the ruins of palaces. Today, when historians speak of the Mamluks, they often speak of their victories, their triumph over the Mongols, their architectural marvels, their wealth and learning. But beneath those achievements lies another story, the story of those who paid the price for their glory, the story of the silent women whose tears built the foundations of an empire that would one day collapse under the weight of its own sins. The Mamluks believed they could own everything: land, power, people, even faith itself. But what they could never possess was the human spirit. The women they enslaved, though stripped of everything, held on to the one thing that no ruler could command: hope. Hope for freedom, hope for forgiveness, hope that their names would not be lost forever. Centuries later, historians still find traces of their existence in letters written by monks, in notes by travelers, in fragments of song preserved in ancient manuscripts. They remind us that history is not only made by kings and conquerors, but by those who endured them. As the wind sweeps across the ruins of Cairo's citadel, it carries whispers from another time. Whispers of prayers said in secret, of songs sung without words, of women who refused to be forgotten. Their fate was horrifying, their suffering immense, but in their endurance lies a lesson deeper than any conquest. That power fades, but faith endures, because in the end, when the banners of the Mamluks turned to dust, it was not their swords that survived, it was the memory of those they tried to silence. And that memory, carried through generations, became their true legacy. So when we look upon the great mosques of Cairo, the citadels, the marble tombs of the sultans, we must also remember the unseen hands that built them, the unseen hearts that broke behind them. The Christian women of the Mamluk era were not warriors, but they fought their own battles, battles of survival, faith, and hope. Their story is not one of defeat. It is one of resistance, of quiet strength against the roar of tyranny, of light that refused to die even in the darkest of ages. And that, more than the glory of any empire, is what history will remember.